In 1959 Texas, a young boy named George Foreman moves with his large family into a new home, or rather a shack, as calling it a home would be an overstatement. After seating the children at the dinner table and cutting the cheapest burger into 4 pieces, George's mother scolds him for immediately starting to eat his portion. She smacks his hand and tells him to thank God for providing the food first.
Thank God for the food first, y'all.
Having quickly devoured his share, Foreman begins to complain, saying he's so hungry he could eat the table. His sister Mary, feeling sorry for him, pinches off a piece of her portion and gives it to him. As she tucks the children into bed, their mother tells George that he'll be starting at a new school tomorrow. She warns him to behave, because if he gets into another fight, he won't be held back again. He'll be expelled and left without a diploma. The next day at school, George, seated among classmates much younger than himself, is called to the blackboard by the teacher. However, upon seeing his tattered clothes, she looks away with disgust and calls on another student instead. At lunchtime, George and his siblings, hungry and without food, watch enviously as their classmates devour chicken, apples, and sandwiches. One of the classmates, noticing George staring, mocks him, offering him bones to gnaw on and mispronouncing his name. Unable to endure the taunting, George defies his mother's advice, punches the bully with one blow, and, demanding his name be said correctly, grabs his things and runs away. 5 years later, Foreman has transformed from a young boy into a typical teenager. Though poverty remains a constant in his life, he turns to robbery, tracking down drunks leaving bars and mugging them in alleyways. One night, he spots a victim, hits him on the head, and starts rummaging through his wallet, only to find a police badge instead of cash. Panicking, the group of robbers scatters, and George dives into a nearby storm drain to escape. Seeing a police officer with a dog, George realizes the dog will undoubtedly sniff him out. To mask his scent, he covers himself in the foul muck dripping from the drain and waits until the police leave. Covered in filth, he makes his way home, trying to avoid being noticed by passers-by. As he navigates through the crowd, which recoils from him, George notices an advertisement for a work corps program. The ad promises housing, clothing, 3 meals a day, and eventually, a well-paying job to all who enroll. Seeking advice from his mother at her workplace, he explains that this is his only chance to make something of his life. His mother tells him he underestimates himself and can achieve much more, but if he wants to join the program, she will support him fully. Arriving at the program and claiming a bed, George unpacks his belongings and finds a box with new sneakers inside. Opening it, he discovers an encouraging letter from his mother. Dedicating himself to his training, George diligently completes all tasks, avoiding distractions. His roommate, Desmond, however, spends all his time on music, partying, and drinking. Fed up, George one day pins Desmond against the wall, telling him he's had enough of the distractions and questioning why he even joined if he doesn't want to learn. A few weeks later, Desmond invites George to the cafeteria. While changing, George notices his sneakers are missing. George complains about his tough life, but Desmond suggests that he probably just misplaced the sneakers and assures him there are no thieves in the program. Shifting the conversation, Desmond mentions that George should thank him for the dessert at lunch. The director, having learned of Desmond's math skills, asked him to audit the cafeteria's books. Desmond discovered that they were overpaying for canned peas and suggested cutting that expense to allocate more funds for desserts. While listening to Desmond, George notices a classmate wearing his new Converse sneakers. When the classmate sees George's gaze, he bolts, prompting George to chase after him. Catching up, George breaks down a door, punches the thief a couple of times, and dangles him out a window, threatening to teach him not to steal. This scene is interrupted by Mr. Broads, the local trainer, who pulls George away and reprimands him, saying he's had enough of George's behavior. This being his 5th fight in a month, Broads threatens to pack George's things and take him to the train station. After George manages to convince Broads to give him another chance, the trainer asks if George knows what boxing is. Leading him to the gym, Broads orders George to get in the ring and pairs him with a small, skinny opponent. Confident of an easy win, George launches into an attack, but every punch misses, while his opponent's strikes hit their mark. After suffering his first crushing defeat, the protagonist storms off, but not before landing a powerful punch on a punching bag. Seeing the potential in the young man, Broads follows him and shares that real fighters don't dwell on a loss in a fair fight, and they don't quit before they've truly started. When the protagonist expresses his reluctance to face further humiliation, Broads reassures him that his opponent was no better than him when he first started and that the protagonist has immense potential. All he needs is to train long and hard, and he might one day join the ranks of the greats. Taking the protagonist under his wing, Broads begins to train him, teaching the correct moves, where to strike, and how to avoid getting hit. A few months later, the protagonist gets his rematch and knocks out the same boxer who humiliated him with a swift knockout in the opening seconds of the match. One day, lounging with a magazine, the protagonist tells Broads that he read about Joe Frazier and wants to take his championship title. Laughing at his audacity, Broads reminds him that Frazier spent about a decade training before facing Muhammad Ali, implying that the protagonist has much more to learn. However, defying all expectations, Within a year, the protagonist, as part of the Olympic team, faces off against the Soviet champion. After taking a few hits, he rallies his strength and claims the gold medal. Returning to his hometown with a medal around his neck, he approaches his friends, who refuse to engage with him. They argue that while their people suffer and die in protests against oppression, he's on stage waving the American flag, acting like some pop star. Relocating to another city, Foreman spots a beautiful girl at the airport and decides to introduce himself. Despite delivering a few awkward compliments, he somehow manages to charm her, and she takes his phone number, promising to call him sometime. As he gets acquainted with his new team, Foreman rapidly advances towards his goal, a fight with Joe Frazier. Winning fight after fight, he simultaneously develops his relationship with Nancy and eventually proposes to her. After winning 36 fights without a defeat, he earns his shot at the title. On the day of the big fight, his coach advises him to be cautious and reminds him not to underestimate a man who defeated the legendary Muhammad Ali. Stepping into the ring and taking a couple of solid hits from the champion, the hero eventually gathers his strength and knocks Frazier down 3 times, securing a victory. Celebrating the win with friends, the hero pulls his neighbor Desmond aside and tells him that the victory has resulted in a substantial sum of money in his account, and he needs someone knowledgeable in finances to help manage and grow his wealth. After betraying his wife with a fan, Foreman heads to the shower. Emerging from the shower, he catches an interview on TV with Muhammad Ali, who, in his typical brash style, promises to knock out the lumberjack, Foreman, in the first round. During a family dinner, Foreman learns that his sister Mary is getting married and that he will soon become an uncle. Delighted by the news, he realizes his wife has been absent for a while. When he gets home, he finds her crying by the phone. Tired of fielding calls from his mistresses, she asks if he still loves her. As he awkwardly looks away, she packs her bags, takes their child, and leaves for her mother's house. Meanwhile, the much-anticipated fight with Muhammad Ali is approaching. Arriving in Africa, Foreman finds his opponent giving another interview, deriding him and claiming that a fight with a boxing dummy would be more challenging. Stepping into the ring, Foreman quickly realizes that the fight isn't as daunting as he thought, and his opponent seems to be just hugging the ropes and absorbing his punches. However, by the 8th round, it dawns on Foreman that he is losing his stamina. A fresh Ali then steps up effortlessly and knocks out the exhausted champion. After spending 6 months in a slump, Foreman slowly starts to make his comeback. Determined to prove to the critical journalists that he is still a champion, he orchestrates a spectacle where he defeats 8 boxers in one evening, one after the other. After the match, Foreman's coach rushes into the locker room and hands him a letter, urgently telling him to read it. Upon reading, Foreman dashes to the hospital, learning that his sister Mary has been admitted with a suspected miscarriage. Fearing for his beloved sister's life, Foreman, a staunch atheist, drops to his knees and begins to desperately pray to God to spare her. Awakening in the hospital corridor the next morning, he enters his sister's room to find her holding her newborn nephew. Meanwhile, his boxing career continues to falter, and after losing another match, he experiences a panic attack and collapses, clutching his heart. After lying unconscious for several minutes, he suddenly revives, rushes into the shower, and declares to those gathered that he had just seen Jesus. Renouncing boxing and undergoing baptism, Foreman returns home to Muhammad Ali and, extending his hand, expresses a desire to apologize. When Ali asks why, since he had beaten him, Foreman explains that he had harbored deep hatred and wished death upon Ali following their fight, acknowledging that such feelings were wrong and shameful. In his typical manner, Ali responds that since Foreman is now a righteous Christian, he should help his brother and agree to a rematch, which could make them a fortune. After settling things with Ali, Foreman goes to apologize to his ex-wife and then stands in the middle of the street with a microphone, starting to deliver sermons. However, the passersby aren't too receptive, and instead of welcoming the new Christian, they mock him, joking that it wasn't Jesus but Muhammad who made him quit boxing. 7 years later, an aged and heavier pastor Foreman preaches in his own church. After one sermon, a woman approaches him with her son, asking Foreman to train him as the boy spends all his free time with his gang-involved friends, and she fears for his safety. Foreman in fact turns her away, suggesting she find solutions in the Bible. However, a couple of weeks later, Foreman sees a news report on TV stating that a group of teenagers was killed during a robbery, among them the woman's son. Realizing he had been ignoring the reality around him, Foreman withdraws some money from his account and opens a gym where local kids can train for free. Yet, a few months later, the electricity in his gym is cut off. Investigating the issue, he finds only $2,000 left in his account, not enough to cover the bills. When Foreman inquires about some investments supposed to have been made by his friend Desmond, he learns that Desmond had mismanaged all his funds, leaving him bankrupt. Struggling to earn some money, Foreman starts accepting offers to appear appear in commercials, featuring in silly ads about ketchup and signing autographs for cash. Yet, the earnings are not even enough to cover his living expenses, let alone maintain his gym. After some thought, Foreman decides to make a comeback in boxing. He visits his former coach, Broads, who initially refuses to train him, citing that boxers returning from breaks often make a sorry spectacle, and he doesn't want to be part of that. However, after some persuasion by Foreman, Broads agrees on one condition: the overweight Foreman must lose 55 pounds in 2 months, as it would be dangerous for him to fight in his current condition. He'd literally break the ring. Foreman starts to take his training seriously, running daily, working out, and eating healthily. Initially, it's a tough regime, and the thought of his gym closing down, leaving the local kids to hang out on the streets, keeps him from quitting. His hard work soon begins to pay off as the scale starts to tip in his favor. After reuniting with Broads, the training intensifies, and Foreman, finally stepping into the ring after his hiatus, manages to win his comeback fight, though not without difficulty. 3 years later, Foreman continues to box and rack up victories, earning a shot at the championship. After 8 grueling rounds, he defeats his opponent and becomes the first 45-year-old world champion in history.